Corporate executives have a habit of killing the things their customers love. It happens in every country, in every decade, and it almost always begins the same way, with a spreadsheet. In 1981, inside an office in Tokyo, a group of executives looked at one of the most successful brands in America and decided to erase it. Not the cars. The cars were fine. They erased the name. A name that millions of Americans had trusted for 20 years. The same logic would later kill Oldsmobile, and Pontiac, and Mercury, and Plymouth. But this time it happened in Japan, which is what makes it worth studying. The brand was called Datsun. By the late 70s, it was one of the best-known import names in America, recognized by the overwhelming majority of car buyers. And the company spent more than $1 billion, adjusted for inflation, to throw it all away. This is the story of two men, two offices 5,000 miles apart, and two ideas that could not coexist. One of them built the brand. The other erased it. One of them won. History remembers who lost. But first, the name. The story begins in Tokyo, in 1911, in a workshop called Kwaishinsha Motor Car Works. Its founder, Masujiro Hashimoto, had studied engineering in the United States, and he returned to Japan with a single ambition. He wanted to build cars that ordinary people could afford. His first vehicle rolled out in 1914. He called it the DAT, after the three men who funded him, Den, Aoyama, and Takeuchi. The acronym carried a small gift of luck. In Japanese, the word DAT also means something close to swift or nimble. A good word for a car. The kind of accident of language that founders like to believe in. The company became the DAT Motor Car Company in 1925. 6 years later, it built something smaller and cheaper. A little car meant for the everyday driver. The engineers gave it a name with a sense of humor. They called it the Datsun, the son of Dat. Then came a problem. In Japanese, the syllable son sounds almost exactly like the word for loss. It is not a message you want stamped on the back of a car you are trying to sell. So they changed one letter. Datsun became Datsun. Sun as in the rising sun on the national flag. A word that had meant loss now meant the dawn. In 1933, the DAT operation was reorganized into a new company in Yokohama, on a stretch of waterfront where the bay air carried salt and the smell of machine oil. Its name was Nissan Motor Company. From that point forward, the company carried two names at once. Inside Japan and on its corporate letter, it was Nissan. On its small consumer cars and on everything it shipped overseas, it was Datsun. Two names, one company. A quiet arrangement that no one questioned. For decades, it caused no trouble at all. Then 50 years later, it detonated. For most of the world, the story of Japanese cars in America starts after the Second World War, and it starts at the bottom. Japan's factories had been bombed flat. Its economy was in ruins. Its people had no money to buy cars, and most of the world had no reason to buy theirs. But the first of our two men had already seen something the rest of his company had not. His name was Yutaka Katayama. Born in 1909, educated at Keio University, he joined Nissan in 1935, only 2 years after the company was formed. He had first seen the United States as a young man, working as a clerk on a cargo ship that carried silk across the Pacific. He never forgot it. The roads, the distances, the sheer appetite Americans had for the automobile. The first Datsuns reached American shores in 1958. A few dozen cars. Nobody noticed. Then, in 1960, NASA sent Katayama across the ocean to study the market. Tokyo expected him to confirm that America was a lost cause. Instead, he came back convinced of the opposite, and he persuaded the company to open its own sales operation on American soil. The first office sat in Gardena, California. A small room, a few desks, a map of the United States pinned to the wall, with red markers showing every new dealer he could sign. Out in Troy, no one was watching. The American giants were building V8 land yachts, 2 tons of chrome and steel. Some of your fathers were on those assembly lines, at General Motors, at Ford, at American Motors. Datsun was not on their radar, not yet. So Datsun grew where Detroit wasn't looking. Among college students, among young professionals. among the people who needed a car that simply ran and did not cost a fortune. Slow, but steady. By the close of the 1960s, the foundation was laid. And what Katayama was about to do with a single sports car would change not just his company, but the way an entire country saw Japanese steel. In 1970, Datsun introduced a car that did not behave like a Japanese car was supposed to behave. It was low, long-nosed, and beautiful. In Japan, it wore a curious name. The Fair Lady Z, chosen by Nissan's president, Katsuji Kawamata, who had a fondness for the musical My Fair Lady. Katayama took one look at that name and knew it would die on an American lot. He refused to sell it as the Fair Lady. He had the badges stripped, and the car reached American showrooms under a single harder designation, the 240Z. It was a genuine sports car, not an imitation of one. A 4-liter inline-six overhead cam, 151 horsepower, 146 pound-feet of torque. 0 to 60 in under 8 seconds. A top speed past 120 miles an hour. Independent suspension at all 4 corners, front disc brakes, rack and pinion steering. At full throttle, the engine sang past 7,000 RPM, a sound that anyone who owned one still hears in his memory. And then, there was the price. $3,526. Consider the company that put it in. A Porsche 911T with 9 fewer horsepower cost $6,430. A Jaguar E-Type cost $5,725. Even the 4-cylinder Alfa Romeo Spider cost more. Datsun had built a car that looked European, drove European, and cost half of what Europe was asking. The car magazines could not believe it. Reviewers who had built their careers praising European machinery now found themselves filling pages about a Datsun. Buyers could not resist it either. Datsun sold 16,215 of them in the first year, then 33,684. Then more than 52,000 the year after that. But the 240Z was two things at once. For Datsun, it was a triumph. For Detroit, it was a warning, and almost no one in Detroit read it. That same year, the American factories were turning out the Chevrolet Impala, the Ford LTD, the Oldsmobile 98. Engines of 5, 6, 7 liters, drinking gasoline at 12 miles to the gallon in city traffic. Somewhere in Highland Park, an engineer looked at a photograph of the 240Z and understood that something had shifted under his feet. He did not say it out loud. Almost no one did. The 240Z was not just a victory. It was a flare fire over the bow of an industry that believed it could not be touched. Detroit would need a full decade to understand how badly it had misjudged the little company from Yokohama. Then, in 1973, the ground moved again, and this time it moved in Datsun's favor. The oil crisis hit. Gas prices quadrupled almost overnight. Drivers sat in lines that stretched around the block. Engines off, waiting an hour to fill a tank. And suddenly, the great American V8 was not a symbol of power. It was a liability. The Datsun that sipped 30 miles from a gallon was no longer the practical choice. It was the smart one. By the end of the decade, Datsun was selling more than 500,000 cars a year in the United States. It had become one of the best-known import names in the country. The badge was everywhere. On race cars, on billboards, on the rear bumpers of millions of satisfied owners who had told a friend. If you owned a Datsun in those years, you remember the feeling. Maybe it was your first car. Maybe it was the car that got you through college. Maybe it was the one you handed down to your daughter the year she turned 18. People loved their Datsuns, really loved them. And 5,000 miles away, in an office in Tokyo, a man was looking at a different picture entirely. He was not looking at a daughter's first car. He was looking at a consolidated revenue report, at a global organizational chart, at a single irritating fact. The company he ran sold the same cars under 2 different names. To him, that was not a history. It was a problem to be solved. His name was Takashi Ishihara. And to understand what he was about to do, you have to set him beside the man who had built everything he was about to inherit. 2 men, 1 company, 2 offices, 5,000 miles and an ocean apart. In Tokyo, dark wood and yellow lamplight and reports stacked 2 inches thick. In the other, in California, sunlight and a wall map and a tray of car keys by the door. And between them, 2 ideas that could not share a future. Start with Katayama, the builder. By 1977, he was 68 years old, white-haired, quick to smile. He spent his weekends in dealerships, talking to the men who sold his cars. He spoke English with an accent and a salesman's warmth. He had backed a racing team, run by Peter Brock, that painted Datsuns in red, white, and blue and beat the Europeans on American tracks. He knew his dealers by name. And he had fought, for years, to keep the Datsun name on the cars. Because he believed the Nissan name belonged to the company's industrial, pre-war past and would mean nothing to a young American looking for something fast and affordable. He had 2 decades of sales to prove it. Then, late 1977, Tokyo called him home, mandatory retirement. The builder put down his tools, now set Ishihara beside him. A former rugby player, blunt by reputation, a man who did not bend easily. He was right. He was not a showroom man. He governed from the figures, from the ledgers, from the consolidated view that only headquarters could see. And the reports told him the company sold the same cars under 2 names, in different markets, with different logos, and to a man who read balance sheets for a living, that was not a strength. It was an inconsistency, a line that did not reconcile. In 1977, Ishihara became president of Nissan. He was not a man who lost arguments. By 1980, inside the Tokyo headquarters, the inconsistency had a target on it. The man who had spent 20 years building the value of the Datsun name was not in the room. He had been retired for 3 years. The same logic that filled that room would one day kill Oldsmobile in 2004, and Pontiac in 2010, and Mercury in 2011. Same logic, different bean counters, different decades. The man who built Datsun in America was gone. The man who would erase it was now in charge. The decision did not happen in a vacuum. The early 1980s were a brutal time to be a Japanese automaker selling into America. On May 1, 1981, a voluntary export restraint took effect. Under pressure from Washington, Japan agreed to cap its car exports to the United States at 1.68 million vehicles a year. At the same time, the yen was climbing. At the same time, Detroit was lobbying Congress for protection. At the same time, Tokyo was wrestling with its own powerful labor union at home. The pressures came from every direction. Not every problem Nissan faced was one it had created. Some of it was the weather of the age. But none of those pressures, not one, justified what the company did next. Late in 1981, Nissan announced its plan. Over the next several years, the Datsun name would be phased out of the American market entirely. The badges would change. The signs would change. By 1986, every car the company sold in the United States would carry one name, and one name only: Nissan. The reasoning on paper was clean. A single global name would be simpler to advertise and simpler to manage. One brand, one identity, one balance sheet that finally reconciled. It was the kind of plan that looks flawless in a conference room and forgets that the customer lives somewhere else. They built a campaign around it. The slogan was 4 words long. The name is Nissan. 4 simple words. And a budget that ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars, all to teach American drivers how to say a word they had never needed. But before, Ishihara had won the boardroom. The boardroom was about to lose America. The transition began in 1982. The dealership signs came down and went back up wearing 2 names at once. Half Datsun, half Nissan, under a tagline meant to ease the handoff. Datsun, we are driven inside the showrooms. Ordinary customers walked in and started asking questions. The company had not trained anyone to answer for the men on the showroom floor. It was an impossible assignment. They were not just selling cars now. They were explaining a name change to people who had not asked for one, reassuring buyers that the company they trusted still existed, that it had simply decided, for reasons no customer could see, to call itself something else. A salesman's job is hard enough without having to argue that the brand on the building is the same brand it was last spring. Because here was the thing the man in Tokyo had not. Wade Datsun was the brand they trusted. Datsun was the brand their neighbor recommended. Datsun was the brand that built that beautiful Z car they had read about for a decade. Nissan, they had never heard of it. Was it a new company? Was it Korean? What happened to the Datsun in the window last year? Dealers reported buyers wandering the lot, looking for a name that was no longer there. Some customers assumed the unfamiliar badge meant a cheaper, lesser car, and they walked back out. Some bought a Honda instead, some bought a Toyota, and some went back to Detroit, to the very cars they had left a decade before. Here is the part that is hard to forgive. Nissan had done the research before it ever made the call. The studies showed that Datsun's name recognition among American car buyers stood near 85%. Nissan's recognition stood well below 5. They had the numbers in hand. The gap was not a surprise to them. It was a measurement. They knew, and they did it anyway. If you worked at a Nissan dealership in those years, or if you were the customer who walked in looking for a Datsun and found a name you did not recognize on the hood, we would like to hear it. Tell us in the comments what that day felt like. Stories like yours are the part of this history. The balance sheets never recorded between 1982 and 1987. Nissan's share of the American market fell hard. By most accounts, the company lost somewhere between a fifth and a third of its sales volume in those years. Toyota, which had kept its name, kept growing. Honda, which had kept its name, kept growing. The importers who stumbled were the ones who confused their own customers. But the deeper wound was never going to show up on a sales chart. Over 20 years, Datsun had built something a balance sheet cannot hold. It had built a community. Picture one of them. You bought a Datsun 510 in 1972, a 280Z in 1978. By 1983, you were driving a Maxima, and you still called it your Datsun, because old habits hold. There is a Datsun cap somewhere in your closet. A faded racing poster, red and white and blue, taped to the wall of your garage, one corner curling loose. You talked your brother into a Datsun, your neighbor, your cousin, the year she finished school. Then one afternoon you walk into the showroom to buy your next car, and the salesman tells you Datsun does not exist anymore. It is Nissan now, same company, same factory, same men, building the same cars. Just relax. The car on the floor looks identical. The engineering is identical, but the name you had been loyal to for 15 years, gone. Not because the cars had failed you, not because the company had, but because a memo had crossed a desk in an office 5,000 miles away, in a building you would never enter, signed by a man you would never meet. That is a strange kind of loss. Quiet, bureaucratic, complete. Would you feel betrayed? A lot of people did. And if you ever worked at General Motors in those years, you already know how this story ends, because you watched a version of it at home. In 1988, Oldsmobile rolled out a campaign with a tagline that has since become a warning in marketing classrooms. This is not your father's Oldsmobile. The longtime buyers heard it correctly. They heard a brand apologizing for the very people who had stayed loyal to it. Sales slid. In 2004, after 107 years, General Motors shut Oldsmobile down for good. The bean counters in Tokyo and the bean counters in Detroit never had to meet. They never did. They were working from the same spreadsheet. The spreadsheet had promised savings. It did not deliver them. The rebrand cost a fortune. Every dealership sign had to be torn down and replaced. Every brochure, every print ad, every piece of marketing the company owned had to be redesigned and reprinted. Every dealer had to be retrained to sell a name no one had asked for. Adjusted for inflation, the full cost of the change ran well over $1 billion. The company that set out to save money spent a fortune instead. Somewhere in 1986, in a town like yours, a man parked his old Datsun across the street from a dealership that now wore a different name. He stood on the sidewalk a while, looking through the glass. Same shapes, different badge. Then he got back in his Datsun and drove home, and the lost ground took years to win back. Not until the late 1990s did the Nissan name finally carry the recognition that Datsun had handed it, free of charge, back in 1981. 15 years. 15 years to rebuild what the company had volunteered to destroy. In those 15 years, Toyota pulled ahead and stayed ahead. In those 15 years, Honda launched Acura and built a luxury brand from nothing. In those 15 years, the loyal Datsun base that had taken 2 decades to assemble quietly thinned out, one disappointed buyer at a time. Which leaves the question that has no answer. If Datsun had lived, would Nissan have passed Toyota? Would it be the #1 Japanese name in America today instead of chasing it? History does not answer that question. History only records that the question exists. For 30 years, that seemed to be the end of it. Datsun was a name on old cars and faded stickers, a memory the company had chosen to bury. Then, in 2013, Nissan did something it had once sworn it never would. It brought the name back, not for America. This time, Datsun was aimed at India, at Indonesia, at Russia, at South Africa, a low-cost badge for first-time buyers in growing markets. It was a quiet admission that the name still carried value, even after 3 decades in the dark. But the revival never caught. In 2022, Nissan shut Datsun down a second time. The sales had disappointed. This time, it looked permanent. And yet the real Datsuns refused to disappear. The 240Z, built between 1970 and 1973, became something its makers never imagined. The men who restore them hunt for original parts, one bolt at a time. Those inline-6 engines were built to run for hundreds of thousands of miles. The steel was thick, the bolts were heavy, the tolerances were honest. You cannot restore a modern commuter car the same way. There is not enough metal left in it to bring back. So Datsun never really died. It went underground. The clubs still meet. The Z-car conventions still fill parking lots every summer, rows of 240Zs and 280Zs gleaming in the afternoon sun. In garages in Milwaukee, in Detroit, in Toledo, men are still rebuilding these cars one weekend at a time. As for the 2 men, Yutaka Katayama lived to 105. When he died in 2015, the deepest tributes came not from corporate Tokyo, but from the Z-car owners, from the clubs, from the people who had kept his cars alive for 40 years. The builder was remembered by the people he built for. Takashi Ishihara retired in 1985, 4 years after the decision, and left others to clean up the cost. Today his choice is taught in business schools as a case study in how not to retire a brand. It is not the legacy any man would choose. Because the bean counters always think the same way. They see customer loyalty as a line on a report, a number to be moved. They are wrong. They always have been, and they always will be. Datsun is not a car company anymore. It is a memory. A memory of when a cheap, honest little car from across the ocean changed how a whole country thought about what it drove. And if you watched this same story unfold at home, at GM, at Ford, at the plant where your father gave his working life, tell us. We read every one. Your story is the part of this history the spreadsheet never kept. If you are still with us, you are the kind of person who remembers when things were built to last. So do us a favor. Tap like if this one is bringing something back. Share it with the guy who still keeps a Datsun in his garage. And tell us in the comments what your first car was. Subscribe if you want a story like this every week. We are just getting to the part that still stings.